I now recognize the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, for the purpose of offering her amendment. Without objection, the amendment is considered as read.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In this report, it does seem, well, first I want to acknowledge that after a long history of various individuals in the body denying the existence of climate change, I do want to say that it's very encouraging to see that there is some acknowledgement of the climate crisis here in the report. But when we look closer, it does seem that it's only mentioned about twice, once to criticize climate science at the U.S. Geological Survey, and once in a section offering scientifically dubious solutions. But in the report, there is a failure to acknowledge the disproportionate impact that these changes have on communities of color and other frontline communities, many of whom are all of our constituents. So I'm proposing an amendment that would require the collection of public health data and other impacts of new drilling on federal lands. My colleagues say that opening more of our federal lands to fossil fuel development is what their constituents want and need. I'm not here to dispute that point in this moment. But I will say that surely if that is the case, then there should be no objection to gathering better data on the health impact of these policies on the health and safety of everyday Americans. So I truly believe this is a common sense amendment that would help protect and inform the American people, especially the most vulnerable among us. And I urge my colleagues to support the amendment, and I yield back.
Does anyone else wish to be?
Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Leger-Fernandez, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the argument of we cannot study something because other stuff is happening just misses the point that we are addressing federal lands here. And looking at the last sentence, which is the operable sentence, it says, the committee will perform oversight to understand how federal fossil fuel programs impact community health and safety, period. And so that's all that says. But I would also point out that when the chair of the Southern Ute tribe testified here, they do have an amazing, and I have visited the Southern Ute, they are a model program for a lot of what they do. But he also always pointed out that they are also pursuing renewable energy projects because they recognize that that is really important, and they are always very federal forward-looking. They're an amazing, have had amazing leadership over the years. I'd like to have the rest of my time. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, would you like to take it?
Thank you, Representative. You know, I think, again, when you look at the text here, while we see that there is historic disproportionate impact, including communities of color, it is not limited to communities of color. We also discuss low-income communities, as well as any frontline or vulnerable community, regardless of race. Historically, we have seen some of those disproportionate impacts, but as the representative noted, the active language here is, I would argue, is in the last sentence, which is that the committee will perform oversight to understand how federal fossil fuel programs impact community health and safety. There are no limitations. While there is past data indicating whether certain income levels of communities, certain frontline communities, this is really about assessing the health impacts on any community that would be potentially exposed to a health risk. And with that, I yield back to the gentlelady.
Gentlelady, yield back. Ms. Leger-Fernandez.
Questionings to the ranking member, Ocasio-Cortez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Director Klein. As the vice-ranking member on the House Oversight Committee, of course, one's background and any potential conflicts of interest are always something that is of high concern. I have not seen any evidence of that here, and I applaud you for your service. In advancing much of our climate policy, I am particularly focused on making sure that we secure good jobs and invest in building and nurturing the skills needed for this new and emerging clean energy industry that is coming, that is here, that has arrived, that is growing, and that will continue to grow virtually no matter what we do because the technology is here and the need is here. However, in the 2021 U.S. Energy and Employment Report, it states that only about 10% of solar and wind workers are presently unionized. Dr. Klein, could you speak a bit about how BOEM incentivizes project labor agreements in these offshore wind projects and BOEM's work with labor, state, and local government to ensure that the offshore wind industry is creating union jobs?
Well, thank you so much for the question. I think certainly when the president set a goal of 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, and then our additional goal to hit 15 gigawatts of floating offshore wind by 2035, he really views this as a way to create jobs here in the U.S., to strengthen our domestic supply chains, and to create real economic opportunities for communities all across the country. So in some of our recent offshore wind auctions, BOEM actually found some innovative ways to include lease stipulations that encourage lessees to really make every available effort to enter into project labor agreements and really ensure that we're creating that pipeline of domestic workers and ensuring that, again, this effort to transition to cleaner energy sources is a job creation opportunity.
Thank you. And Director Klein, I applaud the efforts that BOEM is taking to encourage unionization and PLAs in the offshore wind workforce. I would like to turn now to inquiring a little bit about the community benefits and environmental justice in our offshore wind development. I seek unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from Taproot Earth, a global environmental justice organization that was delivered yesterday to BOEM's Office of Emerging Programs. Director Klein, this letter notes that in a previous offshore wind lease sale notice for waters off the coast of California, BOEM provided a 2.5% credit to developers if they entered into a community benefit agreement. CBAs are agreements signed by community groups and developers that identify community benefits that the developer will provide in return for the community support for the project. However, in BOEM's February 2023 public sale notice for the Gulf of Mexico, no such CBA incentive is offered. So Director Klein, could you please explain how BOEM chooses to incentivize community benefit agreements in their offshore wind lease sales?
Well, thank you very much for the question. Certainly, again, we really are working very hard at BOEM to find innovative ways throughout the process, including the leasing process, to incentivize not just the domestic supply chain, but also ensuring that communities have a real voice in this development moving forward. So you mentioned the community benefit agreements, which are something we have deployed in California. I don't have the details of the Gulf of Mexico proposed sale notice, but would be happy to sort of follow up with your staff to get you those details. I would also say that environmental justice concerns that have been raised to us by communities across the country are also at the forefront of our minds, and so we're working, for instance, in New York and New Jersey to do quarterly community meetings where stakeholders come together and exchange feedback and ensure that we're really bringing benefits to these communities moving forward.
Thank you. Director Klein and Deputy Director Huang, in a recent GAO report, it was revealed that since the 1960s, BSEE and BOEM for it has allowed the offshore oil and gas industry to leave 97% of pipelines. That's 18,000 miles of infrastructure on the seafloor of the Gulf of Mexico when no longer in use. This infrastructure is now inhibiting the development of offshore wind. Deputy Director Huang, I understand that BSEE has discretionary authority to enable oil and gas companies to decommission in place. Can you speak a little bit as to why we are not presently requiring that companies clean up old pipelines? And also, and Director Klein, can BOEM potentially mandate that oil and gas lessees hold fully vested trusts that ensure cleanup of infrastructure and wells?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Congresswoman. We at BSEE are in charge of the entire life cycle, including decommissioning and timely decommissioning. We work closely with offshore producers to ensure that they're true to their commitments. And we've done a couple of things recently to improve that. One was an update to our financial assurance rule to ensure that all parties, not just the current operator, get together and determine how best to address the decommissioning issues and liabilities. Secondly, we also are updating completely our Subpart J regulations to ensure that we're looking at leak detection, pipeline integrity, and also removal of pipelines no longer used to ensure that they're environmentally safe and compliant and removed when not used.
I believe Director Klein has.
Director, do you want to follow up on that quick, like?
Sure. Thank you. I would just say, building off of what Deputy Director Wong mentioned, we work closely with Beth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This 3rd of July, we passed a milestone. It was the hottest day ever recorded on planet Earth. The next day, the 4th of July, was again a record-breaking day as the hottest day ever recorded on planet Earth. Just 2 days later, global temperature records was broken once more. In fact, our planet reached the hottest day ever recorded 4 days in a row last week. For millions of Americans who are unable to access shelter or air conditioning, this past week was deadly. At least 14 people died in Texas and Louisiana, and hundreds were sent to emergency rooms. In my home state of New York, flash flooding 2 days ago left one person dead and entire neighborhoods flooded. This is the climate crisis, and this is just the beginning. It is for this reason that immediate and bold action is necessary to rapidly decarbonize every single sector of the U.S. economy. Coal on public lands has an especially big role to play in this energy transition. Coal creates the most carbon pollution of any energy source. Today, we get about 25% of our electricity from coal, but coal accounts for 55% of the electricity sector's emissions. Over 40% of all coal mining in the United States happens on public lands, and the vast majority of this coal is burned for energy production. In fact, the U.S. Geological Survey found that the federal coal program alone is responsible for 13% of our total greenhouse gas pollution. I'll say that again. The federal coal program alone is responsible for 13% of our total U.S. greenhouse gas pollution. It's clearly time to end all new federal coal leasing on public lands and invest in domestic renewable energy production. As part of this transition, however, we must ensure that we are not simply trading coal barons for solar barons. We must make sure that new jobs are good union jobs and that miners and mining communities are given what they are owed. Miners not only supplied American industry and energy for more than a century, they literally fought and died for workers' rights in this country at a time when union busting was enforced by private militias. I urge everyone in the room who's unfamiliar to look up the Ludlow Massacre or the Colorado Coalfield Wars to understand just a piece of this history. During the New Deal, it was coal mining organizers who led the way in the founding of the Congress of Industrial Organizations and the unionization of not just coal mining, but sectors like automobiles, steel, and electricity. It was these coal miners who formed the core of the New Deal coalition and built an economy that worked for millions of Americans. Any one worker today who has a pension or a union or a weekend owes some thanks to a coal miner, and our coal miners must be first in line for new jobs in the green energy economy. My colleagues across the aisle often point the finger at President Biden's administration's policies, saying that they are hurting coal jobs. But the truth is that coal production has been in decline for over a decade as the free market moves to cheaper, cleaner forms of energy. We know that there is only enough federal coal under lease today to support around 20 more years of mining at current levels. We'll hear from one of our witnesses today about how the development of metallurgical coal, which is used for steel production, not electricity generation, represents an opportunity for workers in Alabama. Nearly all metallurgical coal in Alabama comes from private lands, so this testimony is likely related to a proposed lease from the company Warrior Met to produce metallurgical coal on federal land, which is currently under environmental review. But the idea that this project will spur the local economy is spurious. In a break from tradition, Warrior Met has not even approached the union for this new mine. This isn't surprising, as Warrior Met spent the last 2 years fighting with striking workers in Alabama, the longest strike in Alabama history. Rather than spending money on good union local jobs, Warrior Met has chosen to spend it on billboards in West Virginia to hire scab workers. Coal communities do not deserve empty promises from coal barons. They deserve opportunity and diversified economies, and they deserve to be first in line. This administration created the Energy Communities Interagency Working Group to deliver federal resources to help revitalize America's coal communities. Last Congress, we passed billions of dollars to create good-paying jobs, spur innovation and economic revitalization, and clean up abandoned mine lands through the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the CHIPS and Science Act. I and my colleagues are working tirelessly to ensure that this historic investment reaches the people who need it most. This transition will not be easy, but it is essential, and the future of our planet and every single working American depends upon it. And I yield back.
Now yield to my colleague from New York, Ranking Member Ocasio-Cortez, for her opening statement.
Thank you so much, Chairman. Today's hearing is an opportunity to examine the federal offshore oil and gas program. The urgency to address federal fossil fuel development is undeniable as we endure the 6th straight week of record-breaking heat waves from Arizona to New York City. As it stands, the United States is the world's #1 producer of oil and gas and the 2nd highest emitter of greenhouse gas pollution. Our public lands and waters contribute nearly 1/4 to those emissions. As the federal government, we have an obligation to make our public lands part of the solution to the climate crisis rather than the problem. The Outer Continental Shelf Act, which allows the federal government to lease lands in our federal waters, was passed to secure national energy security. With the support of federal agencies like the Department of Interior and the Department of Energy, our nation has pioneered offshore technologies that set the global standard. But the current arguments characterizing energy independence lose credibility when you discover that the United States is currently exporting 50% more oil and gas than we did in 2019, all while prices we see at the pump here at home and on our utility bills remain high. Why is that? Companies are profiting off of a volatile global market by pushing domestic prices higher, while communities here at home continue to suffer from the impacts of oil and gas development. That, ladies and gentlemen, is what we call an oil cartel. Let's be clear. Oil companies brought in $200 billion in profit last year, while high energy prices meant that many families struggled to keep food on the table. These companies operate with light oversight and almost total disregard for the substantial pollution they cause, their climate impacts, and the neighboring communities that have become sacrifice zones. So whose security is really at stake here? Let's get into what it could look like to protect our workers. To date, offshore drilling companies have amassed thousands of leases covering more than 11 million acres of federal waters. A staggering 74% of these leases have never produced oil or gas. 9 million acres remain leased but inactive. Despite these massive holdings, these companies continue to seek more. Companies will claim they are creating new jobs, but these claims fall flat as we witness the oil and gas industry systematically automate, shedding its workforce, leaving fuel workers with declining wages and uncertain futures as CEOs take in million-dollar bonuses. Between 2008 and 2019, offshore oil production in the federal waters off Louisiana increased by 44%, while direct employment in the industry crashed by 62%. A 2020 survey of offshore workers in the Gulf revealed that nearly 50% had been laid off at least once, and 15% reported being laid off more than once. We are producing more oil and gas than ever with fewer and fewer people. For generations, workers in the Gulf of Mexico have risked life and limb to sustain our way of life. But now it's time to build upon that legacy and look towards the future. We owe American workers energy stability and protection, not hollow promises. So I ask again, as our communities lose jobs to volatile oil companies, whose security is really at stake when we talk about energy security and independence. And let's get into what it would look like to protect frontline communities. Gulf Coast communities bear the brunt of these impacts, economic and environmental. These communities experience the booms and busts of a volatile industry. Oil spills degrade fishing grounds and threaten coastal livelihoods. Pipeline canals and petroleum withdrawal have decimated the iconic boot of southern Louisiana. The release of toxic pollutants from industry leads to respiratory illnesses, disease, and higher rates of cancer. A 2001 study discovered that more than 80% of residents of Port Arthur, Texas, the predominantly Black West Side, suffered heart and lung ailments. Oil and gas infrastructure also destroys habitat and disrupts migratory patterns, endangering local biodiversity. Indigenous communities and low-income neighborhoods, which are more often closer to this infrastructure, suffer significant losses in cultural heritage and subsistence resources. Rather than maintaining the status quo and propping up the fossil fuel industry, let's invest in the cleanup of the thousands of miles of abandoned pipelines and countless abandoned wells and rigs to create jobs and protect the environment. The Interior Department's recently proposed regulations to hold companies better accountable with stronger financial assurances for cleanup of used wells is a step in the right direction. Last Congress, we signed into law historic investments in climate and clean energy, including long overdue reforms to offshore oil and gas programs and essential investments in renewable energy to further the transition through the Inflation Reduction Act. But that legislation also included a deal to tie future renewable energy to leasing to oil and gas leasing for the next 10 years. This provision forces us to choose continued burdens for environmental justice communities or renewable energy development to fight the climate crisis, a choice that we should not be forced to make. It's time we right that wrong and advance renewable energy without forced ties to fossil fuels. Yesterday, I introduced the Non-Restrictive Offshore Wind Act, or the NOW Act, to repeal that tie and pave the way for clean, union-led offshore wind industry. The stakes are high, the health of the planet and the well-being of the workforce and future generations hang in the balance. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses, and I yield back to the chair.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chairman Stauber. And thank you to our witnesses for joining us this morning to discuss the U.S. Geological Survey's critical minerals list. Thank you for joining us, gentlemen. Recognizing the foundational role many minerals play in our economy, Congress has recently tasked USGS with creating and regularly updating a list of critical minerals. These are minerals that are deemed essential to U.S. economic or national security and are vulnerable to supply chain disruption. These critical minerals will play a crucial role in our clean energy transition. For example, we use lithium, cobalt, and nickel, among many other minerals, in batteries for electric vehicles, in wind turbines, and solar panels, all renewable energy technologies that will help us end our reliance on polluting fossil fuels and stave off the worst effects of the climate crisis. Critical minerals will be especially important for the transition of our transportation sector. Transportation is currently the #1 source of carbon emissions in the United States, which makes this sector crucial to decarbonizing quickly. An important aspect of electrified transportation is demand for minerals, and the most non-replaceable critical mineral for electric vehicle batteries is lithium. Now, I'd like to use lithium as a prescient example here. Lithium is already a bottleneck in the global and domestic supply chains for electric vehicles, or EVs. Today, there is only one operational lithium mine in the entire United States. Most of our lithium is currently imported from countries like Chile and Argentina. And our demand for lithium is only expected to skyrocket in the coming decades. Studies show that if today's demand for electric vehicles is projected outward, the global demand for lithium will increase 42 times by 2040. The vast majority of this new demand will be driven by the United States. If demand for EVs continues at our current pace, the lithium requirements for the US EV market alone in 2050 would require triple the amount of lithium currently produced on the entire planet today. Corporate interests and their allies in Congress see this potential for astronomical demand and point to it as a reason for cutting our bedrock environmental protections, ignoring community input, and abusing vulnerable communities among our international trade partners. These private interests and their allies will say that we need to spark a rush to the bottom in order to compete with China, that we can't afford our 200-year-old mining law, they'll say, because China's mining regulations are weaker, that we can't afford to pay union wages to U.S. auto workers, they'll say, because Chinese auto workers already make less. And essentially, major corporations are asking us to engage in a global race to the bottom because when they drive costs down, they profit. But they use those profits to then surge and skyrocket their own CEO pay and not drive costs down, but to drive them up. These race to the bottom arguments prey on a fear of scarcity that is emotionally appealing. But like so many arguments based in fear, this is a false choice. For one, these arguments fail to acknowledge the work the United States can do in other sectors to reduce our reliance on these minerals in the first place. A recent study by UC Davis and the Climate Community Project shows that by increasing mass transit options, bringing EV batteries in line with other nations, and creating a robust battery recycling system, we can reduce our dependence on lithium by as much as 92%. In a world where lithium is hard to come by, these reforms would have huge advantages for our energy and economic security. Race to the bottom arguments also ignore a painful legacy when it comes to mining. Namely, we must recognize that to this day, mining disproportionately harms indigenous communities in the United States and across the globe. In the US, 97% of known nickel deposits, 89% of copper, 79% of lithium, and 68% of cobalt, all critical energy transition minerals, are within 39 miles of tribal lands. And unfortunately, mining on public lands in the US is still governed by the long outdated mining law of 1872, which lacks provisions for tribal consultation, environmental safeguards, permitting requirements, or even royalties, so American citizens can see even a return on these publicly owned resources. But the clean energy transition is an opportunity to reimagine our supply chain, from mineral extraction all the way to end use. And we do not need to choose between sacrifice zones and creating jobs. Using nonpartisan data from the USGS, we can improve mineral efficiency, increase recycling, and build economic security. We can require meaningful consultation with tribes. We can work in partnership with organized labor to build family-sustaining union jobs in mineral processing and manufacturing. And lastly, we can develop trade policy that holds our global partners accountable to the same environmental and labor standards established here, so that businesses have no incentive to leave the US for cheaper labor or resources. It won't be easy, and I firmly believe that with a coordinated whole of supply chain approach, we can reduce demand, prevent environmental and cultural harms, and uphold indigenous sovereignty while enforcing strong labor standards. Thank you.
Statement.
Thank you, Chair Stauber, and thank you to our witness and also our later witnesses for being here today. This committee has a profound responsibility to mitigate the impacts of the climate crisis. We have the unique privilege of being the committee responsible for overseeing our nation's public lands and federal fossil fuel development. As it stands, nearly a quarter of the United States' current carbon pollution comes from fossil fuel production on federal lands and waters. The U.S. is responsible for more historic emissions than any other country in the world. We have a responsibility to lead in winding down use of fossil fuels, and that starts with production on federal lands. Failing to do something about these emissions would be a lost opportunity on a timeline that we cannot get back. As overwhelming as the climate crisis may feel, we can do something about it. In the face of this global existential challenge, communities are doing what they must. They are organizing. And around the world, mass movements of everyday people, frontline activists, organized labor, and others are coming together to demand a change. And their message is clear. It's time to stop the end of fossil fuels. Leaders in some parts of the world are listening. The UN General Assembly, which is also meeting this week in New York City, is focused explicitly on climate change this year. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has called on countries to, quote, leave oil, coal, and gas in the ground where they belong. Countries like France, Spain, and Belize have all passed laws to end fossil fuel extraction, and yet the US continues to approve new leases at record rates. Here in this committee, we're here to discuss that very topic, the federal onshore oil and gas program. The latest announcements from the administration on oil and gas are welcome steps in the right direction to help get our carbon pollution under control. In July, the Bureau of Land Management announced new proposed regulations to bring long overdue reforms to the oil and gas program. And earlier this month, the administration announced it would cancel the remaining oil and gas leases in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and protect 13 million acres of the National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska. These efforts did not happen overnight. For BLM's oil and gas rule, we have people to thank and communities across the country that are beginning to organize on an everyday, person-to-person level. And for the Alaska News, I want to give enormous credit to the young organizers who have tirelessly pushed the administration to do more to protect the Arctic. Of course, many of us were disappointed to see the administration approve the Willow Project, which will have significant impacts on the climate and on essential ecosystems. But it is the organizing of everyday people alongside Indigenous Alaskans affected first and foremost by development and on the front lines of the climate crisis that secured these other victories. Organizing amplifies the voices of people. It empowers individuals and communities to multiply their influence, to speak up, mobilize, and demand accountability from those in power. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record this statement from the Gowitchin Steering Committee statement in support of the cancellation of the leases in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. My colleagues across the aisle will have a different view of the oil and gas program. They'll say that we need to drill more and give away more and more of our federal lands to no end to big oil to ensure so-called energy dominance. But the American people know that security will come when we create an equitable, clean energy economy that puts families and communities first and ends our reliance on a global extractive industry. Of course, we have a long way to go to create a just transition away from fossil fuels. But these recent victories are a lesson in the power of determined, unwavering advocacy. Thank you again to our witnesses, and I yield back.
I would rather celebrate with my great friend, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, Senator Schumer, Senator Sanders, Congresswoman Chu, Congresswoman Bush, Congressman DeGoose, and the incredible young advocates who are behind us who work to create a civilian climate corps. They kept that idea alive, and today we have an American climate corps that has been announced. So we thank all the young people for everything which you have done to make this moment possible. Today, we have seen all of the hard work pay off. And as disasters fueled by climate ravage our communities and our country, we know that this is not a moment too soon. Last year, we took a major step in turning our Green New Deal vision into a reality with the Inflation Reduction Act, ambitious, transformational, economy-wide legislation with jobs and justice and climate at its core. And we thank Senator Schumer for his leadership on that issue, for helping us get that historic package across the finish line. But to put it bluntly, when Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez and I first introduced the Green New Deal, we knew that our solutions needed to be bolder, we had to think bigger, that Washington needed to be braver, and if we were going to combat the existential threat of climate change. And as part of that movement, we envisioned a civilian climate corps for jobs and for justice. And this week, more than 50 members of Congress called on the Biden-Harris administration to take another big, bold, brave step forward and establish a civilian climate corps through executive action. And today, President Biden listened to the movement and he delivered with an American climate corps. So today is an historic day. The president's American Climate Corps will put 20,000 trained Americans to work, mostly young people, trained and getting them paid and turning green investments into a green workforce all across our country. Tens of thousands of Americans working together for energy efficient housing and buildings, for cities that must survive climate catastrophes, for low cost, clean solutions in communities that need them the most, for an effort that will transform our nation to survive a transforming world. When we hear about the crises hitting our communities, climate change, racism, public health pandemics, economic inequality, it's easy to lose hope. But the creator of the original CCC, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, once said, "In these days of difficulty, we Americans everywhere must and shall choose the path of social justice, the path of faith, the path of hope, the path of love towards our fellow man." President Biden's American Climate Corps will improve on President Roosevelt's Civilian Conservation Corps by rectifying the racial and gender inequities of the past in that program, and to build a climate corps for today, for this generation, a vision for these young people who want a better America. And with the Climate Corps, we will find a way, amid those crises, to once again walk the path of hope together. The work begins, not ends, here. We must ensure that this Climate Corps is ambitious, just, and unapologetically pro-union, done for and by environmental justice communities, and coordinated across the government by the White House, so these Climate Corps members tackle projects by the thousands with one shared purpose. And you know, we won't stop in Congress. We'll keep fighting to pass the Civilian Climate Corps for Jobs and Justice Act in order to supercharge the Climate Corps, make it even bigger than President Biden announced today. But today, after years of work alongside young people, unions, service organizations, nonprofits, legislators, and the Biden-Harris administration, we have an American Climate Corps to celebrate. The tens of thousands of American Climate Corps members will not just help us save the world from climate threats, they will help us build a world worth saving. So this is a great day. We thank all the young people for their leadership, for driving this, for creating the movement that created the momentum that made this moment possible for our country. It's just a deposit. We are going to build on this in the years ahead and make it as big as it needs to be to fight the climate crisis. And it is my honor to introduce to you just a historic leader on the issue of climate change, my partner in the Green New Deal, the great Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Thank you so much, Senator Markey. Thank you, Senator Sanders. Thank you, Representative Chu. And we also like to thank Senate Majority Leader Schumer as well for his support in this push. The day has arrived. It is an incredibly historic day and an incredibly historic milestone, not just for the climate movement in the United States, but for organizing movements and people's movements here across the country. When we first introduced the Green New Deal, you know, there were so many cynics in our politics in Washington and beyond saying, this isn't possible, this is too big, this is too ambitious. Well, today we can say that we are starting to turn the green dream into a green reality. When we first announced the idea of a civilian climate corps in revitalizing and restoring the vision of Franklin Delano Roosevelt with the original Conservation Corps, we also wanted to make sure that we expanded it to address the climate crisis today. And we organized and we fought, and people knocked on doors, and they contacted their communities and their elected officials to support a civilian climate corps. And from that, we got a historic inclusion into the Build Back Better Act. But as we saw, there was that setback. And at the end of the day, at the final hour, Build Back Better had fallen apart. And at that moment, we didn't know what the path forward exactly was going to be. But it was out of organizing out of hope, and organizing out of commitment, and organizing that out of faith, if we do our part, maybe the conditions out there will come together in a way that we may not even be able to foresee. And that is exactly what has happened today. We did not expect this to be able to manifest in this specific exact pathway. But because of all of the popular support and grassroots organizing and everyday people coming together and communities saying we will not stand by while the climate crisis ravages our land, burns down our forests, and really just dissolves our public systems, we will stand up. And we're going to stand up for ourselves. That political momentum is what led the White House to approve and begin the American Conservation Corps, which was announced today. Our mission next is to make sure that we expand this and that we grow this. But starting today, 20,000 people will now be able to qualify under the brand new American Climate Corps program. And from there, in addition to that, 5 states have announced their own state-level Climate Conservation Corps programs as well. You all are changing the world. You're changing the world, and you're changing the country. And I don't want you all to forget that. I don't want anyone here to forget that. Because the cynics want us to think that our fighting doesn't matter, that it won't yield anything. And the reason they do that is because they know that if you do fight, you win. If you do fight, you won. And today, you won. So I want to thank you. I want to congratulate you. And I look forward to tens of thousands and in the future, maybe millions, of people being able to be employed and not just in the spirit of service, but in transforming the greater American economy. So thank you all so very much. And with that, I'll introduce the one and only Senator Sanders.
Thank you. Let me thank Ed and Alexandria for their leadership role in this important effort. And we thank all of you throughout this country for understanding that there will not be a future for this planet unless we all come together and make a radical transition from fossil fuel to energy efficiency and sustainable energy. And that is what the Climate Corps project is all about. What many of us have understood from day one is not only that the climate crisis is an existential threat to the planet, and I don't have to tell anybody here what has gone on this last summer. You got to be dumb and blind not to understand what climate is doing, not only to this country. And in my own state, we have suffered the worst natural disaster since 1927. Record-breaking temperatures all over the world. Drought, flooding, people going hungry in southern Africa because they can't grow the food that they need to sustain themselves. So we have a global crisis. And what we have got to do in this country with the rest of the world is move aggressively to take on the fossil fuel industry, transform our energy system away from fossil fuel, and you guys are leading that effort, and I thank you. Point that we have made over and over again is that what we are doing here is not only good and imperative policy regarding climate change, it is good economics as well. And that is what this legislation is about. This is a start, continuing the progress that we have made, of creating millions of good-paying jobs, transforming our economy into a sustainable and energy-efficient way. So good policy is good economics. That's what this legislation is about. So I want to thank the President. I want to thank Ed and Alexandria and all of the people in the House and the Senate who have fought so hard for this legislation. It is a great start. Let's continue to go forward together. And with that, let me introduce Representative Chu.
Well, thank you. What a great day this is. I am thrilled to join Senators Markey and Sanders and Congressmember Ocasio-Cortez to celebrate the official launch of the American Climate Corps. I am just so thrilled that President Biden answered our call, the call of 50 Democratic members of Congress to establish this climate corps, and that now millions of young Americans can join in the fight to make sure that we fight climate change. You know, numerous of us have sponsored bills. I was one of them. In 2019, I sponsored legislation to create a National Climate Service Corps. With that, I felt we could build a better future for our planet, but also create a better future for those involved by connecting participants with opportunities for long-term careers. And what was so important is to make sure that Corps members are paid a living wage and that communities most at risk to the impacts of the climate crisis have a seat at the table when it comes to establishing priorities for Corps projects. But with this Corps, we can do something about the fact that this past summer was the Earth's hottest on record. And from deadly fires in Hawaii to extreme heat in the west to hurricanes and flooding in the east, and where I'm from in Southern California, we know we have to do something about this. Climate change is now a part of our daily lives, and it's in every corner of the earth with long-term impacts on our physical, mental, and economic well-being. But with President Biden's announcement, now we will have a strong workforce for a clean economy, and we can make that clean energy transition. Now we can respond to this crisis, and we can ensure that no community will be left behind, and that we will have 20,000 young people on career pathways to the growing fields of clean energy conservation and climate resilience. So it is a tremendous honor to celebrate this great day, and I look forward to seeing all those young people working to combat climate change. And so now I would like to have a college student and climate justice organizer with this. Oh, okay. Okay, Congress member Cori Bush.
Good. Oh, good afternoon, Green New Deal family. I am so happy and so honored to be able to be here with you all to celebrate this momentous step in our fight for taking a just, economical, and equitable approach to addressing one of the most pressing issues of our time, climate change. I would like to start off by thanking my friends, Senator Markey and my sister in service, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, as well as Majority Leader Schumer and Senator Sanders and Congresswoman Chu, for the work that you all do every single day to not only combat climate change, but to make sure that the approach we take is rooted in equity and justice. I also need to give a huge thank you to the Sunrise Movement. To the Sunrise Movement and to every advocate and activist, whether you are here today or fighting back home, know that we are so grateful and so proud to be fighting in this fight alongside you. And today is proof that we will fight and we will keep fighting, because when we fight,
We win.
when we fight,
We win.
when we fight,
We win.
I'm thankful for President Biden. I'm thankful that he took this crucial step forward to not only help to protect our planet, but to do so in a way that lifts up and supports our communities that are most impacted by the devastating effects of climate change. My district ranks among the highest across the country in rates of asthma, and many people know that I am an asthmatic as well, with rates significantly higher for Black residents than white residents. In St. Louis City, Black children are over 2 times more likely to test positive for lead in their blood than white children. In St. Louis County, residents are dealing with the harms of radioactive waste that was dumped and spread all throughout our community. In my home of St. Louis, we do not only see the impact of climate change, we feel it, we breathe it, we live it. And St. Louis is not alone. There are communities all across the country, especially our Black and brown and indigenous communities, that are dealing with the same kinds of devastating impacts and effects of climate change. That's why today's step by the Biden administration to institute a civilian climate corps is so important. This will have a positive impact on our economy by creating thousands of great, we don't want just jobs, we want good paying jobs. And so this creates good paying jobs for our communities. Furthermore, this program will prioritize and leverage the skills in our communities that have been historically excluded and marginalized. That's exactly what we mean when we say environmental justice. From the Inflation Reduction Act's climate investments to this jobs program, it is clear that the Green New Deal isn't only a winning strategy, it is the strategy. We will not stop until we have a Green New Deal, and we will continue to push to end the climate crisis and bring all of us toward a more sustainable, equitable, and livable future for everyone. We are mobilized, we are energized, we are galvanized, and we are going to win. Thank you. Okay. And now I have the honor and the pleasure to bring to the microphone none other than the Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer.
Thank you, Corey. And I was going to add one eyes. We are not going to be compromised.
We won't.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here with Senator Markey, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, Senator Sanders, Representative Chu, and of course, Corey, and the Great Sunrise Movement as we celebrate President Biden taking executive action to create the American Climate Corps. As you know, last August, we passed the Inflation Reduction Act, the largest climate investment in history ever by a long shot. Now, our country and our economy is being transformed by this historic investment. Already, this down payment has created thousands of good-paying jobs. We made sure of that, not just junkie jobs. And we wanted the jobs to go to people, many people of color and poor people and people who got out of prison and people who never had these jobs before. We need to make sure these funds are going to help those most affected by changing climate and rising pollution. We need to make sure that we're specifically reaching disadvantaged and minority communities that have been traditionally ignored and overlooked, as new climate-related disasters occur almost on a weekly basis. Well, what's the answer to that? The American Climate Corps will do just that. The American Climate Corps is going to focus on communities traditionally left behind. It'll help prepare workers for the new union jobs that are being created across the country using existing IRA funding. The original Civilian Conservation Corps, created by FDR, had the mission to confront a national crisis through a shared sense of purpose. We have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to meet that moment again. It doesn't come around very often, but it is now. And this time, it's to rescue our planet from the climate crisis. And President Biden's answering the call. The IRA funds have the ability to completely revolutionize communities across our country. That's how we wrote it. And we'll work to make sure that communities most in need receive the funding. I want to say a special thank you to the youth activists who pushed so hard for this program. I know I work closely with them in New York, the Sunrise Movement, who led the organizing effort from the beginning. We elected officials want to give all of you a round of applause. Democrats are fighting tooth and nail to make sure the next generation has a country with prosperity, opportunity, stability. These green jobs will build a stronger foundation for the next generation and ones after that. I was just in Allegheny County, along with the Bronx, the poorest county in New York. And they had a factory there. And the factory used to make equipment for coal mining. And they've converted that factory that it is now making equipment for windmills. And it's employing 200 more poor people who were never had a job before. It was a beautiful moment to go to this factory. And that's happening over and over and over again. Green jobs are going to build a stronger foundation for the next generation. The jobs created by the American Climate Corps is going to offer a pathway so that people can get into the middle class and stay there. It'll be an affirmation of the power of the union movement. Industry and labor agree. Our progress on climate goals may be slowed without robust training programs, without the ladders. We believe in ladders so that people can climb up and then establish themselves with a good life. And at a time when unionized workers are standing up and demanding respect, the new American Climate Corps will further strengthen that labor movement. It'll do more than fulfill the critical needs of job training, though. It'll deal with our climate crisis. This year alone, the hottest summer on record, blistering heat waves, deadly wildfires, disastrous smog, historic floods, hurricanes, and droughts. In our divided and polarized time, the American Climate Corps will bring young people of every political orientation, creed, background together, working shoulder to shoulder to combat one of our most pressing global challenges. So I thank President Biden. I thank Senator Markey. I thank Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez for leading the fight to reinvigorate our shared sense of purpose in the fight against climate change. I am proud to be here. Thank you. Hi, Judy. Hi, Corey. Hi, Bernie. Hi, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, Eddie Ann.
Thank you so much, Leader Schumer. And with that, we want to hand it over to, of course, back to the movement. And I'd like to introduce college student and climate organizer with Sunrise Movement, John Paul Mejia.
I don't have a printer. Wow, this is really quite a moment that we're in right now. I mean, this was an idea. This was an idea that held that a competent, caring, ambitious government could maybe solve the climate crisis, not by letting the corporations who got us into this mess get us out of it, but by trusting the people who it's meant to serve and employing them in good union-paying jobs to keep themselves safe. That's what the idea was. And like you said, it was called fringe, it was called naive, it was called all sorts of things, a dream. But thanks to so many people, thanks to unions, thanks to the movement, thanks to leaders of courage like AOC and Senator Markey, and someone who heard the call, President Biden, thanks to all of that, the American Climate Corps today is a reality, and that's what we're here celebrating. I remember, first of all, I could never have imagined myself here even saying something like this only a few years ago. I have a friend and mentor from Miami here in the audience today, and I just remember, like, you know, not that long ago, I was sitting in a family friend's living room watching Hurricane Irma plow through my home state of Florida, watching the windows rattle, and just thinking to myself, how is this getting worse? How is this getting worse? That's what a lot of people in my generation felt. I remember after this hurricane, when the clouds and the winds passed, going outside and seeing my community torn apart. I remember seeing trees toppled over cars like soda cans crushed. I remember seeing brown and yellow lines flooding or staining the walls of people's living rooms. And in that moment, I felt small. I felt disposable. Who was doing anything about this? Where were the adults in the room? But at that moment, I also saw something that changed the trajectory of my life and ultimately led me to be here today with this movement celebrating this win. I saw people in my community helping each other out, like they always have. I saw people rebuilding each other's roofs. I saw people taking care of each other's kids while some others went to go get supplies. I saw people sharing electric generators. I saw people cooking for each other. The truth is, those actions run deep in the history of black, brown, and white working people in this country, and it is what our government should reflect in order to solve something with the magnitude of the climate crisis. That is what the vision was always about when we introduced the Green New Deal. It was about actually dreaming that it was capable for us, like we've done before, to solve a crisis and put our neighbors and our community at the center of it all. And today, we actually notched a win with that vision. Different from the Inflation Reduction Act, which is huge, what the ACC, what the American Climate Corps is doing is seizing the ground and beginning to eradicate a toxic legacy of leaving people to fend for themselves, and rather opening up a new ground of possibility for us to accept a responsibility of caring for each other as integral to the moral fabric of American society. That's what we're doing here. And what did it take to get there? I mean, a whole lot, really. I mean, we knocked on doors, we talked to our neighbors, we mobilized in record numbers during a pandemic to get this message out. We elected new people to Congress that stood with us. Our movement was everywhere, and it was taking over. And there were really dark moments, too, where we thought that we lost. But we held on to hope because our communities and the people and the places we love are too much to give up on. And so, my message to the young people here, in front of me, behind me, is just like look at each other right now and like remember what it feels like to win, because it's kind of rare, but when it happens, it's really special. And remember that in order to get to this moment, you had to go through some really hard ones, but you did it, and we did it together. Going forward, we're gonna have a lot more of these moments, trust, but we are gonna be able to sustain ourselves in that if we commit to each other as a movement and as a community. So that being said, I wanna thank y'all again for helping in this fight with us and making this a reality. And to President Biden, this weekend, thousands of young people were out on the streets asking for more. This morning, you got young people's attention. You decide what you do with that. Thank you.
Now you know why they're so effective. I think we're just going to open up for a brief Q&A. Yeah.
Question and answer that you have. Yes.
Thanks for hosting this. Can you talk a little bit more about what you think Congress needs to do to make sure that this program is effective and has the funding necessary, and more than anything else is sustained against future attacks from possibly Republican administrations that might want to undo this without the force of Congress behind it?
Well, between the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act, the administration has the funding to be able to put this program in place and to create these 20,000 jobs for young people across our country. And then our job is going to be to make sure that this is just a down payment, and that in 2024, young people of all ages are going to come out and work to make sure that in 2025, we dramatically increase this program because by that time it's proven success and the clear need that is going to unfold as each new storm, each new crisis hits our country and our planet.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think one of the interesting things about today's announcement and the form of the American Climate Corps is that it has a dramatic interagency aspect to it. You have the Department of Labor, the Department of Interior, the Department of Agriculture, all working, and many more, all working in conjunction with AmeriCorps, including departments like the Department of Energy, for which a program like this is largely unprecedented. So I believe that deep integration across many of our departments makes this program very deeply rooted already. And our mission from here on out is that when we take back the majority in the House of Representatives, that this represents just a down payment on the program. We want to expand this. We want it to include not only tens of thousands of more jobs, but we also want to make sure that we look forward to partnerships with agencies like the EPA, where we can also more deeply integrate beyond what has just been the opening silo that was announced today.
Questions? Who are you with? Who are you with? No, just from the press. This is a press conference. Thank you all so much. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, everybody.
Much appreciated. Thank you. Wow. Oh, it's amazing. Oh, you are great.
Thank you all for the interview.
Yeah. And we have the environmental justice mapping money to go find the spots now for these young people to go.
Do you want to take a selfie video?
Can we do that?
Celebrate?